The stage lights of America's Got Talent were brighter than Daniel Cruz remembered anything ever being. They weren't just lights, they were heat, pressure, expectation. They pressed down on his shoulders as he stepped out from behind the curtain, blinking as the applause washed over him like a wave he hadn't planned to swim in. Daniel paused for half a second too long. That pause, barely noticeable to anyone else, was filled with a decade of hesitation. The audience saw a man in his early 30s, average height, wearing a simple button-down shirt that had been ironed carefully, but still looked slightly too big. His shoes were clean but worn, the kind that told a story of long shifts and standing for hours. His smile came late, and when it did, it was unsure, like someone borrowing confidence instead of owning it. "Hi," he said into the microphone, his voice thinner than he expected. The crowd responded warmly, but Daniel's hands trembled as he gripped the mic stand. Inside his chest, his heart was doing something reckless. He hadn't planned on this. Just 12 hours earlier, he had been mopping a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, humming quietly to himself so he wouldn't think about the silence waiting for him at home. When his coworker Miguel dared him, half joking, half serious, to audition for AGT, Daniel had laughed so hard he nearly dropped the mop. "Man, I sing for ghosts," he'd said, but somehow that joke had followed him here. Now Simon Cowell leaned forward, studying him the way Simon studied everyone, like a puzzle that might disappoint him. "What's your name?" Simon asked. "Daniel Cruz," he replied. "And where are you from?" "Daniel, Phoenix, Arizona." The crowd cheered politely. "And what do you do for a living?" Daniel exhaled. This part always made him uncomfortable, not because he was ashamed, but because people always changed when they heard it. "I'm a janitor," he said, then quickly added, with a soft laugh, "I clean a hospital." There it was, the subtle shift. Not judgment, just surprise, a few nods, a few raised eyebrows. "So why are you here?" Simon asked. Daniel shrugged, forcing a grin. "Honestly, my coworkers dared me. I sing while I work, and they said I should stop annoying them and let America decide." Laughter rolled through the audience. Even the judges smiled. It worked. The joke landed, but Daniel's chest tightened anyway, because it wasn't the whole truth. The truth was, Daniel had once believed his voice mattered. Once, a long time ago, someone had told him it did. Someone who used to sit on the edge of their war. Not couch, eyes closed, hands folded in her lap, listening like the world outside didn't exist. His mother. She used to say, "Danny, when you sing, it feels like the room breathes easier." He hadn't sung like that in years. The last time he truly sung, really sung, was the night she passed away in a quiet hospital room not unlike the ones he cleaned now. Machines hummed, lights buzzed, and his voice, shaking and broken, had been the only thing he could give her as she slipped away. After that, singing felt selfish, like reopening a wound he wasn't sure would ever close. "So this is just for fun?" one of the judges asked. Daniel nodded quickly. "Yeah, just a joke." The word joke echoed in his head, heavy and hollow. He glanced out at the audience, hundreds of strangers, all waiting for him to either surprise them or disappear. He wondered how many of them were carrying something they didn't talk about, how many of them smiled through loss the way he had learned to do so well. The applause faded into silence. "Whenever you're ready," Simon said. Daniel nodded again, but his body didn't move. For a moment, the stage felt too big. The microphone felt too close. The memory of his mother's voice, gentle, encouraging, rose up like a whisper he hadn't invited. "Don't hide, Danny." His throat tightened. He told himself this was nothing, just a dare, just a joke. He wasn't here to change his life. He wasn't here to heal. He wasn't here to hope. But hope has a way of showing up unannounced. Daniel adjusted the microphone slightly, more to steady his hands than to improve the sound. He looked at the judges once more, then at the audience, and finally let his gaze drop to the floor. He took a breath. Not the shallow kind he used when he was nervous, but a deep one, the kind his mother had taught him before church performances when he was a kid. "In through the nose," she'd say, "out through the heart." The music hadn't even started yet. And already, something inside him was beginning to break open. He didn't know it then, but this moment, the laughter, the modest introduction, the quiet underestimation. Was the last second his life would ever be ordinary? Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories don't begin with confidence. They begin with someone stepping forward anyway, pretending it's a joke, just to find the courage to be heard. The quiet after Daniel's introduction felt heavier than the laughter before it. Not awkward, expectant, the judges waited, the audience waited, and Daniel stood there, caught between who he had been and who he was pretending to be. "So, Daniel," Simon said, breaking the silence, his tone casual but precise, "what are you going to sing for us today?" Daniel swallowed. His mouth was dry, the kind of dry that came when words had been held back for too long. He leaned into the microphone just enough to be heard. It's an old song," he said, "something I used to sing while I worked." "While you worked?" Howie asked, curious. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, night shifts, empty halls, keeps me awake." The audience laughed lightly again, but this time the sound didn't travel far. It faded quickly, like people sensing there was more underneath. "So you're telling us," Simon said, half smiling, "that you clean floors and sing at the same time?" Daniel chuckled. "I try not to do both at once. Slippery floors." More laughter. Simon smirked. "And you think this song is strong enough for this stage?" Daniel hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? Strong enough. He shrugged, a familiar defense mechanism. "I guess we'll find out." Simon leaned back. "All right then, surprise us." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. "Surprise us." He turned slightly toward the band, signaling he was ready. But his mind drifted somewhere else entirely. Back to the hospital. Not the bright, daytime version visitors saw, but the night version. The one most people never noticed. The one where fluorescent lights buzzed endlessly and time seemed to slow, stretching hours into something almost unreal. Daniel worked those halls every night. He knew the sound of tired footsteps. He knew the smell of antiseptic mixed with stale coffee. He knew which rooms were full of hope, and which ones weren't. And sometimes, when the quiet grew unbearable, he sang, not loudly, never for attention. Just enough to fill the empty spaces. "Why do you sing?" Heidi asked suddenly. Daniel looked back at the judges. Her voice was gentle, not testing. He opened his mouth to give the easy answer, the joke answer. But something in her expression stopped him. "I used to sing for my mom," he said instead. The words slipped out before he could stop them. The room changed again. The audience leaned in. The judges stilled. "My mom got sick when I was in my 20s, Daniel continued, his voice steady but low. "She spent a lot of time in hospitals. Singing made her smile, even when nothing else could." Simon didn't interrupt. "She used to say music does something medicine can't," Daniel said. "She said it reminds people they're still human." A murmur passed through the crowd, and after she passed, Daniel added, his voice softening, "I stopped singing for a long time." There it was. The party never shared, so why start again? Howie asked. Daniel paused. The truth rose up slowly, carefully. "Because when I clean those halls at night," he said, "I see people who are scared, alone, waiting, and I remember how much it meant to her. So I sing, just a little, not for me, for them." The audience went silent. No laughter now, no jokes. Simon looked down at his notes, then back up at Daniel. "And this audition," Simon said, "is that for them too?" Daniel nodded. "I think so." He turned back toward the band again, but before the music could begin, Simon raised a hand. "One more thing," Simon said. Daniel froze. Simon's voice softened. "Do you believe in yourself?" The question landed like a weight. Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought of his mother, sitting on that old couch, clapping softly after every song, even the ones he messed up. He thought of the hospital rooms, the quiet thank yous whispered by patients who didn't even know his name. He thought of all the years he had treated his voice like something unimportant. "I didn't," he said honestly. "But I'm trying." Simon nodded once. "That's enough." The band began to play, but before Daniel sang a single note, something had already shifted. This wasn't a joke anymore. This wasn't a dare. This was a man standing in front of millions, choosing to be seen, not as a performer, not as a janitor, but as someone who had loved, lost, and still believed music could make the world a little kinder. Daniel closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he wasn't singing to remember the past, he was singing to let it go. The music began quietly, not with a dramatic flourish or booming drums, but with a single, gentle chord that hung in the air like a held breath. The kind of sound that didn't demand attention but invited it. Daniel stood still. His eyes were closed not because he was nervous, but because he needed the world to disappear. For a split second, the AGT stage faded. The lights softened, the audience dissolved into shadows, and in their place stood a narrow hospital hallway at 2 in the morning. Floors freshly cleaned, lights dimmed low, the world resting in fragile silence. That was where his voice lived. Daniel inhaled slowly, the way his mother had taught him. His shoulders lowered, his grip on the microphone loosened. Then he sang. The first note wasn't loud. It didn't soar. It settled. It carried warmth, like a familiar voice calling from another room. A hush swept across the theater so quickly it felt instinctive. Conversations stopped. Coughs disappeared. Even the judges, who had heard thousands of voices over the years, leaned forward without realizing it. There was something about the way Daniel sang that didn't feel rehearsed. It felt remembered. Each word came out carefully, as if it mattered, as if it had weight. His voice held a quiet roughness, the kind shaped by long nights, swallowed grief, and conversations never finished. It wasn't polished, but it was real. Simon's skeptical expression softened almost immediately. This wasn't karaoke. This wasn't a joke. This was a man telling the truth in the only language he knew how. Daniel opened his eyes halfway through the first verse. He looked out at the audience, not scanning, not searching, just letting himself see them, hundreds of faces, different ages, different lives, all listening in the same silence. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He wasn't thinking about technique. He wasn't thinking about pitch. He wasn't thinking about winning or losing. He was thinking about his mother's hand resting on his arm. He was thinking about the elderly patient who once whispered, "Thank you," from behind a curtain after hearing him sing. He was thinking about all the times he had chosen quiet instead of courage. The song moved into the chorus. This was the part that always broke him. His voice wavered, not from lack of control, but from emotion rising too fast. The note cracked, just slightly, like glass under pressure. A collective inhale swept through the audience. Daniel almost stopped. For a heartbeat, fear rushed in. They'll think I messed up. They'll think I'm not good enough. But then something unexpected happened. No one laughed. No one shifted uncomfortably. They stayed with him. Daniel felt it, an invisible hand holding him steady, so he continued. The crack in his voice didn't disappear. It became part of the song, part of the story. His voice grew stronger not because he forced it, but because he stopped fighting it. By the second verse, the room was no longer watching him. They were feeling with him. Howie's mouth hung slightly open. Heidi pressed a hand to her chest. Even Simon, famous for his restraint, didn't look away. The lyrics spoke of loss, of holding on when everything tells you to let go, of loving someone even when they're already slipping from reach. Daniel sang as if each word was a confession. His hands trembled now, not from nerves, but from release. He hadn't known how heavy the silence inside him had been until he started letting it out. And then, halfway through the final chorus, he saw something that nearly unraveled him. In the crowd, a young boy sat beside an older woman. The boy had his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, eyes closed, tears running freely down her face. They weren't watching a show. They were remembering someone. Daniel's chest tightened. His voice faltered again, but this time he didn't try to steady it. He let it shake, let it bend, let it break just enough to be human. The final note stretched longer than he had planned. He held it, feeling it vibrate through his chest, through the room, through every person who had ever needed to hear that it was okay to feel. When the note finally faded, Daniel didn't move, he didn't bow, he didn't smile. He just stood there, eyes closed, breathing through the silence that followed. It lasted only a second, but it felt like forever. Then the audience stood, not slowly, not politely, all at once. Applause crashed over him like a wave he couldn't escape even if he tried. Cheers echoed from the balcony. People clapped above their heads, some crying openly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Daniel opened his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He looked at the judges, stunned. Howie was clapping harder than anyone. Heidi's eyes were glossy, her smile trembling. Simon sat still, but there was something different in his expression. Something unguarded. Daniel's chest rose and fell rapidly. Tears blurred the lights overhead. For the first time in 10 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Not pride, not victory, permission. Permission to be seen, permission to be imperfect, permission to believe that his voice, broken and honest, still had a place in the world. And as the applause continued, Daniel realized something that would stay with him long after the stage lights dimmed. He hadn't come to AGT to be famous. He had come to heal, and somehow, by doing so, he had helped others heal too. The applause didn't stop. It rolled through the theater like thunder, rising and falling in waves that felt almost unreal. Daniel stood frozen at center stage, the microphone still in his hand, his heart pounding so loudly he wondered if anyone else could hear it. The lights above blurred into soft halos as tears welled in his eyes. He hadn't prepared for this part. The silence before the applause had been terrifying, but this was overwhelming. Daniel tried to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came. He pressed his lips together, nodding slightly as if that might somehow express the gratitude crashing through him. Finally, the clapping eased just enough for Simon to lift his hand. The room quieted. Daniel turned toward the judges, wiping his face quickly with the back of his hand, embarrassed but unable to stop the tears from falling anyway. "Daniel," Simon said, his voice steady but softer than usual. That was unexpected. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the crowd, easing the tension. Simon continued, "You walked out here smiling, telling us this was a joke. But what you just did, there was nothing funny about it." Daniel swallowed. "That was real," Simon said, "and real is rare." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. Howie leaned forward next. "I've seen a lot of performances on this stage," he said, "but every once in a while, someone reminds us why we started watching in the first place. You didn't just sing a song. You told a story." He paused, gesturing toward Daniel's chest, "and it came from here." The audience applauded again, softer this time, like an agreement. Heidi spoke next, her voice trembling just slightly. "Daniel, when you sang, I stopped being a judge. I was just a person listening, and that doesn't happen often." Daniel's shoulders shook. He bowed his head, overwhelmed. Then Simon leaned forward again. "There's something I want to understand," Simon said. "You sing like someone who's been through something big." Daniel hesitated, but something about the room felt safe now. My mom," he said quietly. "She passed away 10 years ago. I stopped singing after that." The audience murmured softly. "I sing at work sometimes." Daniel continued, "In the hospital. Not for me, for the people who are hurting." Simon nodded slowly. "And tonight," Daniel looked around the theater, "tonight, I think I sang for myself too." That was when Simon stood up, not dramatically, not rushed, just, deliberately. The audience gasped. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. Simon didn't say anything at first. He walked over to the desk, resting his hand on the large golden button that had changed so many lives before. "Daniel," Simon said, turning back to him, "this show isn't about perfection. It's about moments, and you gave us one." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "Thank you, sir." Simon held up a finger. "You reminded us that talent doesn't always come from confidence." Simon said, "Sometimes it comes from pain. And sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is share it." The audience was completely silent now. Then Simon pressed the button. The sound echoed through the theater. For a split second, Daniel didn't understand what had happened. Then the golden confetti exploded from above. Gasps turned into screams. Applause turned into cheers. The entire room erupted as gold rained down like sunlight made solid. Daniel's knees nearly gave out. He stared upward, mouth open, tears streaming freely now, his hands shaking as the confetti brushed past his face, caught in his hair, clung to his clothes. He laughed and cried at the same time. I don't know what to say, he stammered. Simon smiled, a real smile. You don't have to say anything. Daniel sank to one knee, overwhelmed, pressing his hand to his chest. The crowd chanted his name. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. He looked up through tears and whispered into the microphone, his voice barely audible but carried by the silence that followed. My mom used to say, if you sing from the heart, he said, pausing as emotion overtook him, someone out there will feel less alone. The audience broke again, louder, deeper. Daniel lifted his gaze toward the ceiling, closing his eyes. Mom, he whispered, we did it. The judges stood. The audience stood. Even the camera operators paused for a moment, caught in the weight of it all. This wasn't just a talent show anymore. It was a shared moment of humanity. One person's vulnerability unlocking something in everyone else. As the confetti settled, Simon leaned toward the microphone one last time. Daniel, he said, no matter what happens next in this competition, you've already won something far greater than a trophy. Daniel nodded, clutching the microphone like an anchor. He had walked onto the stage believing he had nothing to lose. He was walking off with everything to gain, and in that moment, under the golden rain, Daniel realized that kindness, honesty, and courage didn't just change his life. They changed the room. The confetti was gone, the lights dimmed, and the stage, once filled with thunderous applause, stood quiet again, but for Daniel Cruz, nothing felt the same. In the hours after his audition, he sat alone in a small waiting room backstage, his head still buzzing, his chest still tight with emotion. The golden buzzer moment replayed in his mind like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the crowd standing, felt the warmth of the lights, heard his name echo through the theater. Someone knocked gently on the door. A production assistant smiled. Your phone's been blowing up, she said. You might want to look at it. Daniel hesitated, then picked it up. Hundreds of messages, thousands of notifications. Clips of his performance were already spreading, shared by strangers, reposted by nurses, doctors, teachers, and people he had never met. Comments flooded in faster than he could read them. I played this for my mom in hospice. I lost my dad last year. This helped me breathe again. Thank you for singing for people like us. Daniel set the phone down, hands shaking. He hadn't sung to go viral. He had sung to survive. Yet somehow his voice had found its way into places far beyond that stage. A week later, Daniel was back at the hospital. Same uniform, same mop bucket. Same long, quiet halls, but something was different. As he pushed his cart down the corridor, a nurse stopped him. You're the singer, she said softly. Daniel blinked. Yeah, I guess. She smiled, eyes shining. My patient in room 214 asked me to play your song again last night. She said it made her feel brave. Daniel nodded, unable to speak. Later that night, an elderly man waved him over from his doorway. You're the one from TV, the man said. The one who sings like he understands. Daniel swallowed. I try. The man smiled. Don't stop. So Daniel didn't. He sang more openly now, not louder, but freer. Sometimes patients listened from behind curtains. Sometimes nurses paused in the hallways. Sometimes people cried. Sometimes they smiled. Daniel learned that music didn't need a stage to matter. It just needed honesty. Months passed. Daniel continued on AGT, performing again and again, not as someone chasing applause, but as someone sharing pieces of his heart. He didn't win the season. Another act took the final prize. And strangely, Daniel felt no disappointment, because his victory had already arrived quietly, in hospital rooms, late night messages, and the gentle courage of people who said his voice had helped them keep going. One evening, after a long shift, Daniel sat alone in his small apartment, the city lights glowing faintly through the window. He pulled out an old photo from his drawer, him and his mother on that war. Not couch, her hands clap, his mouth open in song. I didn't hide this time, he whispered. He framed the photo and placed it by the window, not as a memory of loss, but as a reminder of purpose. Daniel began visiting hospitals on his days off, volunteering to sing for patients who wanted music instead of silence. He didn't charge, he didn't promote himself, he simply showed up. Sometimes he sang for rooms full of people, sometimes he sang for just one, and sometimes he sang for someone who couldn't respond at all. But he always sang. Years later, in interviews, people asked him what changed his life. Was it the golden buzzer, the standing ovation, the viral video? Daniel always shook his head. No, he said, it was realizing that what I thought was small was exactly what someone else needed. His story became a quiet reminder shared online, in classrooms and in break rooms across the country, that courage doesn't always roar, that kindness doesn't need permission, that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that almost stayed silent. And somewhere, in a hospital hallway late at night, Daniel Cruz still sings, his voice echoing softly off polished floors, carrying warmth into rooms filled with fear, grief, and hope. Not as a joke, but as proof that when you offer your heart to the world, even in the smallest way, the world changes with you.